Marcus was no stranger to torment. The constant bullying he faced felt like something ripped straight out of a grim novel. Ultra-violence at its most absurd. Older students would pelt him with rocks, grab fistfuls of his hair, yank him around by his unusually large ears, and shove him into the muddy bank near the soccer field. Not too long ago, someone torched his locker. I never learned who was behind it, but rumors spread like wildfire while we were stuck outside in the rain during the fire drill. Marcus was an easy target. He was overweight, with pale, almost waxy skin, and an odor I'd rather not dwell on. His nose looked like it was being tugged upward by invisible strings, and his hair, a dull, mousy brown, was wiry and unkempt, like damp straw. Glasses might have helped him see better, but they never lasted more than a day before getting broken or snatched away, and public assistance could only stretch so far. The worst part? He wasn't exactly sharp academically. This wasn't one of those tales where the quiet brainiac eventually outsmarts their tormentors through success or ingenuity. In class, Marcus floundered, but honestly, it wasn't all his fault. Our school was pitifully underfunded, leaving kids like him without access to the resources or support they desperately needed. He lived on the wrong side of town, in a trailer park tucked away on the outskirts that my mom had warned me about when I was younger. "Stay away from there," she'd say. I didn't know much about his home life until it became headline news. Despite everything, Marcus had one thing he excelled at. When I was little, around 5 or 6, I actually used to be friends with him. Back then, it hadn't been social suicide to hang out with him. Whenever we spent time together, he'd bombard me with fascinating facts about bugs. Even years later, whenever he managed to find a rare moment of peace at school, he'd spend it hunched over in the corner of the playground, digging through the dirt with a rusty fork. Any insects he uncovered went straight into a small plastic bag he carried everywhere. He'd fill that bag with just about any tiny creature he could get his hands on. Once it was nearly full, he'd seal it shut and mash its contents into a fine paste using a rock. For the rest of the week, you'd rarely see him without that bag clutched tightly in his hand. That is, until someone inevitably stole it, forcing him to start the process all over again. Nobody liked Marcus. I wasn't exactly fond of him either, though I never felt the need to go out of my way to make his life miserable. If you'd told me last year that I'd end up spending my summer hanging out with him, I probably would have laughed in your face. Or worse. It all started with a little girl's bike. My friends and I were messing around in my cul-de-sac when Chad, the glue holding our group together, and kind of an idiot, decided it would be hilarious to swipe the bicycle belonging to my neighbor's 5-year-old daughter. We egged him on, and he rode it around for most of the day before dumping it by the creek as the sun went down. As soon as I got home, my mom cornered me about it. Apparently, that poor kid had been bawling her eyes out in the middle of the street all afternoon. Guilt hit me hard, and I caved, snitching on Chad immediately. He ended up getting fined some undisclosed amount, and once everyone found out I was the one who ratted him out, I became persona non grata. Within days, I knew what it felt like to walk in Marcus's shoes. Yard time at school turned into lonely hours of standing by myself, feeling sorry for myself. Still, even then, I refused to lower myself to befriending Marcus. That seemed unthinkable. This went on for weeks, stretching into months. By mid-June, the isolation was eating away at me. I thought long and hard about reaching out to Marcus, maybe trying to patch things up, or just find someone, anyone, to hang out with. But every time, pride won out, and I convinced myself I wouldn't stoop that low. Eventually, though, fate stepped in. One morning, my mom woke me up around noon, saying there was someone waiting for me at the door. Heart racing, I jumped out of bed, hoping it was one of my old buddies, maybe even Chad, coming to bury the hatchet. Instead, I opened the door to find Marcus awkwardly standing on my porch, shifting from foot to foot. "What do you want?" I snapped without thinking. "I was wondering if you wanted to hang out today," he said in his nasally voice, barely meeting my eyes. I hesitated, torn between annoyance and desperation. Finally, I shrugged. Sure, whatever. I shouted back to my mom that I'd be home before dinner and headed out with Marcus, figuring anything was better than sitting alone in my room all day. Our first conversation was painfully awkward, like something straight out of one of those cringy how to make friends guides. He tried a few polite icebreakers, cracked a couple of lame jokes, and offered me a piece of apple-flavored gum. I declined. It came from a stained pack, but eventually, we settled into something resembling normalcy. We wandered down to the creek, talking and poking at things with sticks. As it turned out, Marcus wasn't so bad once you got past the surface stuff. For starters, he didn't actually live in a trailer. His stepdad owned the park, and they lived in a big house at the edge of the grounds. His mom worked long hours, somewhere. I don't remember where. And Marcus spent most of his time alone. As we were walking, carefully navigating a moss-covered log, Marcus suddenly let out an excited squeal and pointed at something I couldn't see. Without hesitation, he leapt off the fallen tree and dropped to his knees, digging through the mud. Curious, I crouched beside him and watched in amazement as he pulled out the largest, fattest grub I'd ever seen from beneath a damp leaf. Whoa, dude, that's disgusting, but kinda cool, I exclaimed. Marcus held the wriggling creature, uncomfortably close to his face, staring at it like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. After a moment, he snapped out of his trance and rummaged through a fanny pack slung around his waist. He pulled out a plastic Ziploc bag filled with what looked like a rancid paste made of crushed bugs. Using his teeth, he opened the bag and gently placed the grub inside before sealing it up again and shoving it back into his pack. "Why do you do that?" I asked bluntly. "Do what?" Marcus replied, looking genuinely confused. "You know," I said, gesturing vaguely. "That whole thing with the bags and the bugs." Marcus shrugged earnestly, and that was the end of the conversation. This became my summer routine. Almost every other day, I'd spend hours hanging out with Marcus, usually down by the creek. I did my best to avoid being seen by any of my old friends. If word got out that I was spending time with Marcus, any chance of regaining my social standing would be gone for good. One particular day in July, Marcus and I were heading to our usual spot when I peeked over the edge of a small but steep hill, just ahead of him. My stomach sank when I spotted Chad and a few others making their way toward us. Panicking, I dropped to the ground and scrambled backward before bolting in the opposite direction, leaving Marcus behind. Panting, I hid behind a tree and peeked out to see Chad and his crew lock eyes with Marcus as he climbed down the slope. Before he could run like I had, they pounced on him. I watched helplessly as they shoved his face into the mud, stomped on his hand, and twisted his neck. Unable to bear it anymore, I turned around and walked home. I didn't see Marcus for a few days after that. When he finally showed up at my door again, he had a black eye and a swollen lip. Stupidly, I asked, "Are you okay?" But I left it at that. I didn't apologize. I didn't think there was anything to apologize for at the time. It was during this visit that he suggested we hang out at his place instead. Reluctantly, I agreed. Despite my mom's warnings, I followed Marcus to the trailer park. It was as rundown as I'd imagined. Scrap metal and rusted car parts littered the front yards of the trailers, and clothes hung limply from wires, dripping onto the already soggy ground below. The whole place felt eerily deserted. Marcus's house stood apart from the rest, further down the trail. It was a modest bungalow, though at least it had a fresh coat of paint. Tacked onto the side was a tiny reception area. Marcus explained that his dad owned the dump next to the park, which explained the low rent. As for his mom, she worked long hours somewhere. He wasn't sure where, but she was gone most days. The first thing I noticed inside was the dust. Every surface was coated in a thin layer of grime, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. The air smelled strange, indescribably odd. The wallpaper was mismatched, and as I studied the dozens of framed photos hanging on the walls, I realized each one seemed to depict a completely different family. I was too distracted to ask about it. We spent the afternoon drinking sodas and munching on snacks. which Marcus seemed to have an endless supply of. We discovered we were both huge fans of the same trading card game, so we spent hours playing it in his room. His collection included some rare, expensive cards, and every time his back was turned, I slipped one into my pocket. Marcus's room was an absolute disaster. The stench of urine hung heavy in the air, and black mold crept along the corners of the walls. Clothes were strewn everywhere, mingling with roaches that scuttled freely across the floor. Whenever one crossed his path, Marcus would crush it with his bare hand, then wipe the remains on his pant legs as if it were nothing. By this point, I'd decided that spending the summer alone wasn't such a bad idea after all. After we'd exhausted every activity he could squeeze out of my reluctant visit, I made up some excuse to leave. "Wait!" he shouted, grabbing my wrist just as I stepped outside. "What?" I snapped, gritting my teeth as I tried to politely pull free from his grip. "There's something I really want to show you," he said, snorting excitedly. "I can't believe I haven't shown my best friend yet." I sighed deeply. "What is it, Marcus?" "My Maggot Farm," he declared proudly, already leading me toward it. The heat outside had cooled slightly but was still oppressive. Marcus ignored my barrage of questions, choosing instead to silently drag me along. We ended up at the far edge of the trailer park, where a thin strip of forest separated the trailers from the rusted corrugated fence surrounding his dad's dump site. A section of the fence had collapsed, and atop the debris sat an old white water tank surrounded by smaller pieces of trash. The tank stood about 4 feet tall and 6 feet wide, not counting the lid. I hung back, watching Marcus struggle to pry the massive metal cover off. Chuckling to myself, I glanced around and realized how isolated we were. Before I could offer to help or reconsider staying, Marcus managed to shift the lid enough for a wave of the most nauseating stench I'd ever encountered to hit me like a freight train. I gagged violently, clutching my baseball cap over my nose and mouth. "What the actual hell, Marcus?" I choked out through the fabric. "It's my Maggot Farm," he explained matter-of-factly. "I've been working on it for a while now. I collect roadkill, let it rot in here, and soon it's crawling with maggots. Come take a closer look." I stared at him in stunned silence. He looked like a child showing off their prized art project, beaming with pride. When I didn't move, immediately he spoke again, his voice firmer this time. I said, "Come take a look." Reluctantly, I shuffled forward and peered over the rim, determined to get it over with quickly. For a moment, I thought my eyes were deceiving me. I forced myself to look again, longer this time, to confirm what I was seeing. The tank was brimming with decaying meat, intestines, tufts of fur, shards of bone, all swirled together in a grotesque soup. A sickly yellow oil pooled around the mess, slick and shimmering under the fading light. And worst of all, it teemed with thousands upon thousands of writhing maggots. The tiny white bodies squirmed in their vile nest, clusters of eggs hatching into new generations destined to become flies and restart the cycle. "Marcus, this has got to be the most disgusting thing I've—" Before I could finish, Marcus swung a discarded tire iron into the back of my head. My vision went black, and I crumpled to the ground. I woke up an indeterminate amount of time later. Minutes? Hours? It was impossible to tell. Darkness enveloped me completely, suffocating and absolute. As I drew in a panicked breath, the rancid smell confirmed exactly where I was. I tried to stand, but my head slammed into the underside of the lid. Panic surged as I slipped in the swirling stew of decay that rose above my waist. I fell backward, gagging as some of the filth seeped into my mouth. I vomited instantly, adding my own bile to the revolting concoction. The stench burned my nostrils, stripping them raw. Then came the bites, the minuscule, relentless gnawing of countless maggots feasting on me. It felt like being swarmed by invisible insects burrowing into my skin, laying eggs beneath the surface. My skull throbbed with pain, each heartbeat amplifying the agony. In my dazed state, the first thing I checked were the trading cards I'd stolen earlier. They weren't in my pocket anymore. Ruined, probably. But that thought barely registered compared to the terror gripping me. I began pounding on the steel walls of my prison, screaming for help. No one answered. There was only silence, broken by the faint squelching sounds of the maggots writhing around me. My foot brushed against something solid near the far side of the tank, and I recoiled in horror, curling into a tight ball as fear consumed me. I'd never been more terrified in my life. My cousin once told me about sniffing glue, and not too long ago, I'd tried it myself out of curiosity. The fumes rising from the rotting sludge had a similar effect, only worse. It felt like my brain was shutting down, cell by cell. Eventually, through sheer force of will, I managed to form a coherent thought. I needed to chip away at the rust lining the inside of the tank. Fumbling blindly in the darkness, I searched for anything that could serve as a tool. In my mind, I imagined finding a sturdy piece of bone, but what I actually found was far stranger. It had a metallic core with two rigid strips of fabric attached to either side. It was a watch. Holding it up, I fumbled around in the pitch-black void until I located the buttons. Pressing one did nothing but produce a faint beep. Another press yielded the same result. But when I pressed the third button, the small digital display lit up briefly, casting an eerie glow. In that fleeting moment of light, I saw him. I froze. My frantic thrashing momentarily halted as the maggots continued their relentless assault on my skin. With trembling hands, I pressed the LED again, holding it down this time. Across from me sat Marcus. He was shirtless, or perhaps completely naked, and watching me with unsettling calmness. When he realized I'd seen him, he smiled. That's when it hit me. The firm lump my foot had grazed earlier wasn't just another chunk of decaying meat. It was his leg. Words failed me. Panic choked off any attempt at forming a coherent question. "What the heck?" I finally spat out, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus giggled softly, offering no explanation. Instead, he returned to plucking maggots from the putrid stew and popping them into his mouth. The sight made me gag violently, though there was nothing left in my stomach to expel. What came up now was pure bile, burning my throat as it escaped. Once the retching subsided, I remembered my plan. Shoving the watch into my pocket to avoid looking at Marcus again, I resumed feeling around in the sludge. Almost immediately, I found what I was searching for. A jagged piece of jawbone, likely from a deer or large dog. Gripping it tightly, I began scraping it against a patch of brittle rust. Layer by layer, flakes of oxidized metal peeled away. Summoning every ounce of strength, I drove the bone into the weakened spot. A hole the size of an olive appeared, letting in the first rays of natural light I'd seen in what felt like eternity. Desperate for fresh air, I pressed my mouth to the opening, accidentally inhaling tiny shards of rust as I gulped down the clean air. As I shifted my weight against the walls of the drum, I felt something beneath me. A weak spot, though I couldn't reach it with my hand. My shin brushed against another patch of rust near the base, where poor welding had joined the two halves of the tank. Still clinging to the smaller hole with my lips, I kicked furiously at the deteriorating barrier. Moving my legs was like wading through molasses, but I persisted, striking repeatedly until my foot finally broke through. Hope surged within me as I stomped at the loose debris, widening the gap until it was large enough for a 12-year-old to squeeze through. "Hey! Hey!" Marcus bellowed from behind me. Ignoring him, I took one last deep breath through the smaller hole before pinching my nose, closing my eyes, and plunging beneath the foul surface. Leaving my baseball cap behind, I groped blindly for the exit. My fingers grasped the jagged rim, slicing my hand on the sharp edges. Summoning every bit of strength, I yanked myself downward and emerged headfirst into freedom. Like a newborn breaking free from the womb, I gasped for air as my filthy face broke the surface. My arms followed, clawing at the grass in front of me as I dragged myself out. But I wasn't free yet. My waist caught on the jagged edge, trapping me halfway. Clumps of sodden earth tore loose as I struggled desperately to pull myself free. Suddenly, I felt a hand grab my ankle. Marcus was trying to drag me back in. I screamed, planting my palms firmly on either side of the opening and pushing with all my might. Kicking wildly, I fought against his iron grip. Finally, the sole of my shoe connected with his jaw. The impact sent me tumbling backward, propelling me fully out of the tank and onto the rot-soaked ground. As soon as I broke free, I ran. Staggering to my feet, I bolted as fast as my exhausted body would allow. I stumbled through the tangled underbrush, narrowly avoiding an old, rusted washing machine half buried in the dirt. I didn't dare look back as I sprinted past the trailers, their occupants staring at me with a mix of confusion and revulsion. Cutting through the creek, I avoided being seen in my grotesque state. Finally, I emerged near my house and dragged myself the last few yards, utterly spent. This happened during the summer of 1995, a moment that changed everything for me. To this day, I attend therapy regularly, not just because of what occurred that day, but because it inevitably comes up in almost every session. My mother was so shaken by what had happened that she called the police. An officer arrived at our home to take my statement. After I recounted the harrowing events and he finished his coffee, he thanked us and prepared to leave. But just before stepping out, something caught his eye. The digital watch sitting in our kitchen trash can. It was the same one I'd found in the maggot tank, the one my mother had thrown away along with my ruined clothes. The officer turned pale when he saw it. Wrapping his hand in tissue paper, he carefully picked up the filthy device, which bore an oddly familiar gecko-patterned strap. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice low and unsettling. I explained that it was the watch I'd mentioned in my account, the one I'd discovered inside the maggot-filled drum. My parents never told me what happened after that. They likely thought they were protecting me. The next day, local news outlets reported that a small business owner and devoted family man, whom I later realized was Marcus's father, had been arrested. Whenever the topic came up on TV, my mother quickly changed the channel. As far as I know, I never saw Marcus again. He stopped coming to school, and rumors circulated that he'd gone to live with an aunt in another state. In his absence, I became the new target for anyone with anger issues or a troubled home life, enduring relentless bullying throughout middle school. Now, at 42, I have kids of my own, a 6-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl. I left my hometown long ago and now lead a peaceful, happy life. Recently, my brother visited and told me about a Facebook group dedicated to alumni from my old school. Curious, I decided to check it out with my kids, hoping to share some lighthearted nostalgia and explain the challenges I faced growing up. The most recent post featured a boy I didn't immediately recognize, though I soon remembered he was the younger brother of Simon, an old friend. A few days prior marked the 30th anniversary of his disappearance. The comments section overflowed with sympathy and memories shared by former classmates. I looked at the photo of the smiling boy, and then glanced at my son. As a parent, stories like these hit painfully close to home. His sweet grin and rosy cheeks brought tears to my eyes as I imagined the anguish his parents must have endured all those years ago. I'll never forget the way my children stared at me, bewildered, as I dropped the phone and collapsed to my knees, sobbing uncontrollably into my hands. They couldn't understand why I reacted the way I did. They hadn't noticed the watch the boy in the photo was wearing, nor could they grasp the significance of its gecko-patterned straps.